Thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar, which is Commercial Real Estate During a Pandemic, presented by Cushman & Wakefield Waterloo Region. My name is Allison Mitchell and I'm part of the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce team. Before we start our webinar, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to share. Your microphones should be muted at this point, but if you could double check to ensure that we reduce background noise, we would appreciate it. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, and you can do so by typing your questions into the questions box in your control panel. Our presenters will be answering your questions throughout the webinar as well as at the end of the presentation. Following the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to today's webinar recording. Our presenters today are Benjamin Bach, Vice President of Leasing and Investment Sales, and Michael Polzl, President and Broker of Record for Cushman & Wakefield Waterloo Region. I would now like to invite Benjamin and Michael to begin their presentation.
Thanks so much, Allison, and thanks very much to the Chamber of Commerce for facilitating this series of webinars. I know that as somebody who's has a business, we found them very useful on our end, and we're happy to be able to provide some insight into our slice of the world.
Yes, and thank you as well to the Chamber for facilitating and creating this forum for all of us to talk about real estate, especially in these challenging moments and at this time. And I would like to start off by talking about Cushman & Wakefield in general. It's a global real estate services firm founded over 100 years ago. There's 53,000 employees globally in over 60 countries and over 300 offices. And our local team is very robust. We've got full retail, office leasing, industrial, investment sales professionals, including appraisal in the form of valuation advisory services that we have as an offering on a regional basis. But we're very much integrated across the country throughout 22 offices as well. So we regionally have very much been involved with many of our clients and helping them through these challenging moments, as well as Cushman & Wakefield globally has had frontline experience with COVID-19 and its impact on the markets that they serve. And this report and presentation today is a culmination of that experience as well as what we're seeing regionally.
Yeah, so adding on to what Mike said, we operate in all the major markets globally, and there's a number of regions that are ahead of us on the timeline dealing with the COVID pandemic. And we've already started moving people back into offices throughout Asia and in some markets in Europe. So we put over 1 million workers back into their offices. And there's some pictures up here on the screen showing some of our offices in China, as well as Taiwan and Singapore. And on our right, it's the newly opened office of ours in Sydney, where they've started to retrofit. And you can see on the ground, there's some of the Safe 6 office retrofits. And in Canada, we manage over 20 million square feet of properties, including properties that have remained open during the entire pandemic. Those might be properties that are housing essential services like grocers or hardware stores or medical facilities. And so we've been helping our clients not just deal with what this is going to look like afterwards and how to reopen, but also over the last 2 months, we've been assisting the essential workers and the frontline workers as they've needed to operate their workplaces. So what we wanted to cover today, we want to start with talking about the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance, the CECRA, that was unveiled about a month ago, and there have been new details coming out. Just want to give a bit of an overview of some of the technical things, and then we're going to shift to another slide where we talk about some of the more practical items and some of what we're hearing from landlords and tenants on this, as well as some potential strategies around lease modifications to manage cash flow, some strategies that we've seen been successful on both the occupier and the landlord side. So the CECRA is a federal program, and essentially for qualifying tenants, the landlords are able to apply to get 50% of the gross rent owed by a tenant for 3 months, April, May, and June, as a forgivable loan. The loan would be forgivable if the eligible tenant doesn't have to pay more than 25%, and if the landlord of the eligible tenant reduces their portion of the rent another 25%. And then it lays out what an eligible tenant is. So you have to pay less than $50,000 per month in gross rent. So that includes the base net rent as well as the taxes, maintenance, and insurance, the common area maintenance. Your company, including the parent company, has to generate a maximum of $20 million in annual revenue, and you have to have experienced at least a 70% drop in the pre-COVID-19 revenues, and that can be measured either year over year. So you could look at either April, May, June 2019, or you can also use an average of January and February against the average sales. So there's a few different metrics there. And for tenants who are going to apply with their landlords, if they have already paid April, May, or June rent, the landlord can either refund that amount or provide a credit to the future month's rent. So those are the technical details. The applications open next week at 8 a.m., although there is a staggered application date. So if you're a landlord in Ontario, you can apply on Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on the number of tenants you have. And then Friday, people from any jurisdiction can apply. The deadline for landlords to apply is the end of August of this year. The forgivable loans can be applied retroactively or credited against future months of rent. CMHC is facilitating applications for the program and has made sample forms available, although they say they might change before the launch on the 25th. Landlords have to make the application, not the tenant, and it is not mandatory for landlords to apply. So Mike, I'm not sure if you want to add anything. We can talk about how it's been received, which I think we might have some questions about.
Yes, the program is there to assist, but as Ben had mentioned, there's no obligation for the landlord to entertain it. So at this stage, although there's been great disruption between tenants and tenants specifically not being open and not being able to make their rent payments, and landlords navigating and negotiating in many cases with the tenants, that this program is very early stage, and we're not certain as to what the adoption will be, but it is something that is helpful and can be viewed as a positive step to landlords and tenants being able to retain each other as we move forward in this.
Yep, I agree, Mike. There was a question that came in. Allison, did you want to read that off now?
Yeah, I can do that. So the question is, if an annual lease is July 1 to August 30th and is extended annually, does that disqualify because it's not a lease that is longer than August 30th?
So my understanding, and we'd recommend that people seek accounting advice whenever they're dealing with some of the individual financial discrepancies and variables. Our understanding is that the length of the lease term beyond the period isn't one of the factors. It's more so if you were open prior to the pandemic and you have the sales that you can track against. That's what I've seen in terms of the parameters with dates, not necessarily when your lease runs until. They are refining this constantly, so I believe this week there was an update from CMHC. 2 weeks ago there was another update from CMHC. So they might have additional guidelines or criteria, but as of now I haven't seen that.
Okay, thank you. We do have one more question, so I will read that question to you. From a landlord perspective, we are still seeking clarity around how the pre-profit amount will be calculated and what exactly constitutes fixed costs. As we are only entitled to receive reimbursement for the pre-profit amounts from the government's 50% and the tenant's 25% allocations, this is very important in order for a landlord to quantify the true percentage of rental loss they need to forgo, which could be much greater than 25%.
Yeah, I agree. Mike and I were talking earlier today about some of the things we've heard from our clients on both the landlord and tenant side. Mike, I don't know if you want to speak to that, or I can chat about the conversation I had earlier today with the landlord.
Yeah, please, Ben. One item is that their landlords come in all forms, shapes, and sizes. They're not a homogeneous group. So that exact question is something that directly impacts certain landlords that have no mortgages and have maybe triple net leases where the tenant typically takes care of everything outside of the base rental rate. So it's something that requires further questioning, and again, as Ben had mentioned, please speak with your accountants, your lawyers, to make sure that you're getting the proper advice. But again, there's more to come on this. This is a first run at what we think is probably going to be some updates or changes in the future. And Ben, please share what your communication was about.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I had another call with a client this morning who both leases and owns space, so they're on both sides of it. And as a landlord, one of the properties they have, similar to what Mike was just saying, doesn't have a mortgage on it. So for the last couple of months, or the last month or so, they've been tracking the CECRA, because when it came out initially, it said that it was for people who had mortgages. And then there was an update to come out to say if you didn't have a mortgage, there would be some assistance, but details were pending. And then there were some more details that came out this week in the update that said mortgaged and mortgage-free properties will be dealt with similarly. So it has continued to evolve. And the landlord this morning was asking, among other things, how do they calculate the profit they'd have to forego? The accountants that give them great advice weren't able to quantify it yet. And they also said that their lawyer raised some questions around who's carrying the liability. So as an example, one of the things that a tenant has to be able to show in order to be an eligible tenant, I'll just go back a slide, is that they have to have experienced at least a 70% drop in pre-COVID-19 revenues. And there's the criteria for how to measure that. But the landlord is the party making the application, and the landlord is the party that would receive the forgivable loan. So the landlord this morning asked me, they said, Ben, what if my tenant is not being a good actor and actually falsifies some of this revenue information? They were just asking the hypothetical that their lawyer raised. There wasn't a specific case. The landlord said if it's then determined that the tenant wasn't really eligible, but the landlord has already applied and the landlord's already gotten that forgivable loan and only received 25% of the rent from the tenant, does the landlord then have that liability? Does the landlord have a mechanism to recover that amount? And one of the unfortunate things is that their lawyer said they didn't have the clarity on that yet. So this program was announced a few weeks ago. Applications open May 25th, so that's next week. But to date, tenants have heard they will be getting rent relief, and they've heard some great things around that their rent can be reduced 25% if they're eligible. But landlords, who are the parties that have to apply, a lot of the ones we're talking to, and this includes landlords that are very, very willing to help their tenants out. They want to help their tenants out. They see it as an asset in addition to being good business that their tenants stay on as going concerns. So we're seeing landlords across the board seeking clarity on how to apply, because in general, everybody who's an occupier who's paying rent is at least asking their landlord about the program. And so that'll lead us into our next slide, some of the reaction to the CECRA. And so these are news articles that have come out over the last couple of weeks. The one on the right about the Ontario Premier is probably that's from last week. There was some talk about if landlords aren't going to apply, Ford said you don't want to see what'll happen. So there was definitely a bit of a veiled threat there. You can see this article saying the long wait for rent relief and what went wrong with the business rescue plan. The article in the middle from yesterday is from Retail Insider. It says critics say the newly announced commercial rent relief with forgivable loans for landlords is too little and too late. And from what I'm seeing anecdotally from my friends who own restaurants, from my friends who own barbershops and hair salons, what I'm seeing in some of the various industry discussion groups on Facebook and LinkedIn is that very few people are satisfied with the program, whether on the landlord side or the occupier side. And sometimes everybody being a bit upset is the sign of a fair program, but sometimes it's a sign of a program that still needs to be tweaked and refined. And there's definitely been some rumblings that there will be further tweaks, yet to yet to come down the pipeline, and it is different in each province. So some things that we're counseling tenants and landlords, and so we'll start with tenants. Be transparent and upfront with your landlord. Don't be on the wrong side of your lease. Take a look through your lease to see what items of value you can trade with your landlord if you need some short-term rent relief. So some examples of that are maybe you have a restrictive covenant in your clause, maybe you have a development clause which allows you to prevent the development of a site. If there's some things that you can trade the landlord in order to get some short-term rent relief, we might find that's a win-win situation. Prepare to substantiate your need for relief and make a reasonable ask. So with these last 2 points, I think some of us have seen the headlines about large public companies or private equity-backed companies that own retail brands that announced back in March they weren't going to pay rent for 3 months. Some of these companies are closed, some of them are still open, some of them are operating at reduced capacity and certainly reduced profits, but still operating. And some of these groups, which are very well capitalized, have just announced to landlords they won't pay rent. So that immediately puts them on the wrong side of the lease. But more consequential for local businesses is that really handcuffs landlords' abilities to deal fairly with local mom and pop or small businesses where there might be a real need for relief. So we have some clients, whether they're retailers or tech companies, that are still doing well. So I spoke with a retailer earlier today whose sales are definitely down, but is doing a brisk takeout. And that's somebody who can pay the rent. Now, they haven't asked their landlord for a month of free rent or 2 months, but there are people we are hearing about who are still operating, still have sales coming in, and they're saying, oh, well, we can't pay you, even though they might have the ability to, and that's impacting the landlord's ability to offer rent relief to people that really have nothing coming in. So one thing we're telling tenants is make sure that what you're asking for you really need. Make it a reasonable ask, something you think the landlord could say yes to, and see what items of value you have to offer the landlord. And then going back to the point about you don't want to be on the wrong side of your lease, there's a lot of long-term implications to being outside of the agreement, whether you're in default or whether the landlord could put you into default. It could compromise your ability to get back your security deposit. It could compromise your long-term renewal rights. It could compromise your ability to even control that space long-term. So we're really telling clients to take a long-term view. If you need some rent relief, what can we offer the landlord? And we'll talk about that in another slide, and make a reasonable ask.
Just to add to Ben's comments, communication is the number one thing that we're encouraging in your dialogue with the property owner. The application of reasonableness is the second thing, but it should be a solution-oriented conversation about what can be offered, what can they offer, and finding some middle ground. It's a very costly exercise for a property owner to look at a tenant leaving and closing for good. And the costs of going through a program, as we've covered earlier, through the federal assistance, or even if it's a amendment of the existing lease where terms are agreed upon that allow for rent deferral. So landlords are looking at deferring the rent. And it could be all of it, could be portions of, but that at some point there is a commitment to repay it over time. There is, if there's limited lease term left on the property and the assistance is something that's needed immediately, there's an opportunity here for groups to negotiate a longer term favorable extension. So on numbers that make sense for both the landlord and the tenant, gives the landlord some comfort to know that their risk is at least blended out or mitigated in the short term by adding some years or some time onto your existing lease, and possibly also opening up and having a conversation around, in exchange for an extension, getting some free rent as well. and maybe some other packages that the landlord is prepared to offer you. So, there is an opportunity here to have meaningful conversations that extend beyond the immediate extreme circumstances and can give you a favorable solution for the years to come. From a cost-benefit perspective, it's a much better approach to, from a landlord's perspective, to negotiate with a tenant, find a solution, versus having that tenant lost forever. And if you can imagine, if there's a package that's put together where both are happy and they move on, that's great. But it's a much costlier exercise for many landlords to lose the tenant, then having the opportunity cost on two fronts. One is having no tenant in place for quite a long time, could be 6 months, could be a year. At that time, the new tenant, if they find one, is likely talking about different terms, which may be less favorable. And the landlord also has direct costs. So in that case, there's leasing commissions, there are tenant improvement dollars. So sometimes there's a financial package that a landlord offers as a function of the deal. That's now an investment they make. Landlords work, or property owners work, to prepare the space for the new tenant. And free rent and fixturing periods and things like this all have a very costly effect on the landlord. So generally speaking, most of our clients and groups that are working with their tenants are viewing it this way and are trying to find a solution where, yes, there's some collective responsibility. This is a pain that everyone feels, and coming up with a solution that makes sense. One thing that I'd like to note is that many landlords have mortgages and have operations they have to fund. So for every dollar of base rent, or the net rent that the landlord gets that's separate from the common area fees and the property taxes, there's cents on the dollar that the landlord collects as going towards their bottom line. And so the landlords definitely want to find a solution there, versus having a cash flow pinch where they are definitely dealing with paying their mortgage and dealing with other expenses that continue on even though the rent's not coming in. So there is a definite willingness of many landlords to find a solution, because the alternative is quite costly.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mike. So I was just reaching for my phone because I got a note from another landlord this morning where we represent the occupier, and we're trying to work out some different lease modification scenarios. And the landlord said, we have mortgages in place. The banks expect us to pay full pop. Why should our tenants who have corporate covenants be any different? So that's a landlord that's definitely taking a hardline approach. But that's a case of somebody who, there's an investment pool, there's mortgages, there are in some cases pension holders who need cash flow every month. It's a really complicated financial web that's been woven, and it's not as simple as saying, let's just not pay rent this month, let's just not pay rent next month. Why won't the landlord agree? It's definitely a lot more complicated. And every landlord's different, especially when you start talking about a public landlord versus a private landlord, or somebody who owns a couple of properties versus a life co, and when you're talking to somebody who owns the asset versus somebody who manages the asset. So I think Mike covered the next half of the slide very well, but what we're telling our landlords essentially is be empathetic. Where you have the ability to help your tenants manage their cash flow, you should help if you can. And we're not saying forego all your profits, we're not saying forego your lease payments, but it doesn't help anybody if your tenants go out of business, and it really doesn't help the person who owns the tenant's space. So like Mike said, there's both the sense of being a good corporate citizen, and then there's also the very hard dollars and cents decision that it makes more sense to help your tenants get through this difficult time and stay open and be able to be a great tenant and provide cash flow for the next several years than it is to try to extract full pop from somebody who has no money coming in, who's been forthcoming and open and honest.
and both landlords and tenants won't forget the efforts made now. So down the road, if there's another circumstance that requires the other party to work with them, they're going to remember that when it was very challenging and the opportunity was there to work with them, that that'll be a favorable scenario down the road. And so to add to Ben's comments about what we're sharing with landlords is this is a good opportunity to do a blend and extend or to negotiate terms of the lease that give both the tenant, the occupant, some flexibilities at this stage, but also creates a fair outcome down the road as we move through this. And separate from that, there's also a great opportunity to enhance tenant and landlord relationships as well, where in the future, because of what's happened now, certain tenants may be happy to grow with landlords. I need more space. Do you have anything else in your mix of availabilities? Let's talk about that. Right sizing tenants. Some tenants or occupants may not need all the space moving forward. We've seen a lot of that in the news recently with many firms recognizing the digital solution to working and that being remote has worked well. So there may be an opportunity for landlords to say, okay, I see where you are at. I do have some space that's perhaps smaller that we can move you into, or on the alternative, some are doing quite well under the circumstances and maybe need more. So there are always ways to create that stickiness and to keep that relationship going forward on a positive basis. Landlords also have the opportunity right now to talk about certain restrictive covenants or things in their leases that may not be favorable, but the tenant is prepared to possibly give up on them in exchange for some help as well. So that's another solution where we say, okay, you can look at various factors here. Maybe there's some things that both of you are prepared to move on, and maybe there's some things here that the landlord can benefit from as well. At the end of the day, is as Ben mentioned earlier, anything that takes you as a deviation from your lease is then a situation where you're negotiating, because the lease is a contract, and all those terms in there, albeit they were negotiated at a different snapshot in time, different circumstances, it's still an agreement. So if there's a way that through communication and negotiation, finding a solution that works for both, that's the right way to reopen a lease. Not talking to your landlord and stakeholders is a very challenging situation and leads to limited outcomes.
Yeah, and building off what Mike said, and then I see we have a couple questions that have come in, so we'll pivot to that. There are some very well capitalized tenants that have ceased communication with their landlords. So I heard the CEO of a REIT, a real estate investment trust that owns a couple $1 billion worth of assets, and they said that one of their tenants that has stopped paying rent, even though they're still open, has a better balance sheet than they do. They have more cash on hand and they're not paying rent. So there definitely are some people that are acting in a way that will be remembered on both sides, and it's unfortunate. Allison, did you want to read a couple of the questions?
Sure. So the first question, if revenue for June is more than the requirement, can we claim for 2 months?
So again, I would recommend somebody seek individual advice from an accountant or a lawyer. My understanding is a landlord has to apply for 3 months, which would imply the revenue drop has to be there for 3 months. That's my reading of the most recent clarification.
Okay, great. Thank you. Second question, based on what you've seen and from your client base, do you have a percentage estimation on how many landlords that don't have a mortgage are still planning to apply for the program?
It's a good question. I know that anecdotally, I think all of our landlord clients have had tenants if they own retail properties, have had tenants ask them about the program. I don't think the tenants necessarily know if their landlords have debt or have a mortgage on the property. So I would imagine there will be a good number of people who don't hold mortgages applying for the program if they're able to determine it's right for their situation. I know I've spoken with a couple of clients. I've spoken with a couple of clients who don't have mortgages who've been asked to apply, one of whom will be applying or is planning to apply. The other is still trying to work through some details with their legal and accounting counsel. So I think it depends.
Generally speaking, the brokerage and commercial real estate services business doesn't track mortgages tied to properties. But I believe that with looking into what the registry office has, you can see whether there is a mortgage on title or not, and that is for a fee and subject to obviously being able to access that through visiting the office or other means. But generally speaking, most landlords out there do have mortgages on their properties. So it's not unusual for that to be the case, and I would say there's more mortgage properties than those that are without.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Okay, those are all our questions right now.
Perfect. So let's chat about some lease modification strategies we've seen, we've used with our clients, we've seen used in other markets as well. So these are just examples. We'd be very happy to review the leases you have with your tenants or the lease you have with your landlord to see what we think could happen. Amortization of a rent abatement over a short or long term. So this might be something as simple as saying the landlord will reduce the rent 50% for the next 2 months, and in exchange for 2 months next year, you might pay 50% more rent, or for 6 months next year, you might make up that portion of rent savings next year when revenue should be higher. Second point, abatement in exchange for a term extension. This is something we're negotiating with one of the tech companies we represent. They love their office space, they want to stay in their office, but they don't think they'll be in it for the next couple of months, and they've already been out of it for a couple of months. So they know they want to stay, and we're going to the landlord and saying, if we can get a break on rent for the next few months, we'll actually sign a 5-year deal now, even though our rent is up in a year and a half, because we know we want to be here long term. And that plays into the next point, a blend and extend. So we'll take the lease we have now, we'll add on 3 years or 5 years or 8 years, and in exchange for that, the concessions you would have paid me in 2023 when I did this renewal, I would get paid now, and as a tenant, I can apply that towards whether it's renovations for social distancing, or perhaps negotiating a rent abatement with that unused landlord TI contribution. One thing that we've seen a couple of our clients use is where a tenant had to be shut down and had no money coming in, but had a sizable security deposit on hand. We've seen landlords let tenants draw that down and then replenish it to get back in line with the lease. We have seen tenants ask if they can pay more rent in 2022 in exchange for paying less rent this year. So they're not sure what next year will look like, but they are pretty sure in 2 years they'll be able to pay a higher rent, and they think the savings now will be worth it. We executed a renewal on behalf of a client where we got a tenant inducement contribution from the landlord, and we had language in there that would allow us to apply it towards rent if we so choose. So that's flexibility we're helping our clients work in. And again, something Mike mentioned is a rental rate abatement in exchange for lease modifications favorable to the landlord. So maybe there was a term you negotiated in your lease a couple years ago that allowed you to expand next door, and maybe the landlord really wants to get that lease right back, and in order to get it back, because they think they have somebody for that space, they're willing to reduce your rental rate. So seeing what you have to offer that the landlord would want, and what price would the landlord put on it. So again, every lease is different, every landlord, every tenant and space is unique, but these are some things we've seen be successful, and we'd be happy to look at individual scenarios offline with people.
There's a few more things as well which we've encountered over the last months, and that is for multi-market offices, industrial facilities, retailers, where they are in many locations, whether that's throughout Canada or the US or Europe or Asia, where some of the unrequired, unneeded real estate that they have commitments for with landlords is now on the books. And so what we have also seen is lease buyouts, where a tenant comes and says, I don't need this space anymore. I want to get things straightened out, and let's talk about a dollar amount that makes sense. Many landlords, if it's a dollar amount that makes sense, would probably take the deal, allow for the lease buyout to occur, because they could say, well, my prospects of releasing it may be what they are, and I may be comfortable in taking dollars now. And cash is king, as we all know. That at this stage, they would take the cash and then release the tenant of their obligations. And at that stage, they would be looking at leasing out to someone new down the road, and they've got a bit of a cushion to work with. So that's another option, is a lease buyout scenario. And there's also, from an opportunistic perspective, there are locations out there that were previously unavailable. So whether you're an office occupier that strategically needs to be within a specific market or in a specific submarket of a market, or for logistics reasons, things have changed. You want to be closer to major arteries where your trucks have to travel less from your facility, but to where they end up being on the highway and out to where you are distributing beyond. Or if it's a retail location, there are opportunities now with the unfortunate circumstance of certain tenant groups not necessarily surviving or coming to terms with their landlords, that real estate's going to free up. So we've seen a trend with our retail leasing professionals that it's the right time now to find good locations at favorable lease terms versus what we had seen pre-COVID-19, and securing real estate which makes sense for the next 5-10 years. And so there is an opportunity out there that once we're through this, there is a window for you to be able to go and get the better location you've always wanted.
Yeah, well said. The best players of the real estate game are the long-term strategic thinkers, and I know I learned this when I started playing Monopoly, but some locations are better than others, and we don't see that changing. So now let's talk about things that are potentially changing a bit. I want to talk about what workspaces might look like when we come back to them, which is something we're very interested in, both as real estate professionals and people who have an office. So here's a floor plan that was done up, looking at how, without any renovations or without buying any more furniture, you could add social distancing into a space. So if you look closely here, essentially what's been done is furniture's been removed and rearranged. But this is a situation where you wouldn't require any capital expenditure, and if you wanted to implement social distancing, you'd be able to do it. Now, of course, you don't have the same capacity. That's probably the obvious thing that you think about when you open up to thinking about something like this. One client of ours who we spoke to yesterday, they told me something very interesting, which is as the work from home order went from 2 weeks back in March before March break to extending out to a month and a half to now, I think we're in our second month of it, they started letting their employees come into the office to bring home desks and chairs and monitor stands and ergonomic keyboards, things that they would need to work well from home. And with something like this, where you're actually taking desks and furniture out, one suggestion is, send it home with your staff so that they can set it up, as opposed to having a bit of an ad hoc setup. And then, you can bring it back to the office when we're able to get into a bit more density. But a lot of the solutions coming out right now, or a lot of the thought leadership, can be expensive. And this is a way to be able to modify the office with less expense. Some guiding principles that our firm has put together around the Safe Six. So a lot of this is about the necessary social distancing. So it's a 6-foot quick scan. We do a quick look at the working environment and we see where are the areas of most impact. You can see there's a bit of a floor plan down there we did for a client looking at directional flows. That's the 6-foot routing, as well as you can see some carpet tiles there. And then let me bring up the next page or the next slide. So these are some pictures from our office in Belgrade, as well as Sydney, Australia, as well as the Puma office we retrofitted in Eastern Europe on behalf of the client. And so you'll see there's some routing, one way only. There's some signage about the number of people allowed in the space. And as you might guess, those meeting rooms would have had a higher capacity before. And then even within the meeting rooms, there's stickers on the desk. This is a seat you can sit in, this is a seat to avoid. So some low cost ways. Most of this is all being done with adhesives on various surfaces, while facilities and workplace groups plan out what changes they want to make as they bring teams back. So I think a lot of us have seen some headlines about different companies going fully work from home. There's been some interesting Facebook and LinkedIn commentary around, I love it, or I hate it, or I can do a bit of it. You know, we're seeing all sorts of things. Apple wants to get back to the office by the summer, whereas OpenText has said they think they're going to keep their talent hubs, but smaller locations that are a bit more of a satellite location, they don't think they'll keep. Shopify was in the news yesterday saying that they're going to go to a work from home scenario until 2021, so for the balance of the year, and then become digital by default. And so what a lot of these companies, like if you've read some of what OpenText said, I guess last month already, they're not talking about giving up the office. They still want to keep what they call their innovation centers, their talent centers, these hubs where they bring people together to collaborate and really get creative in a way that's hard when you're working from home. But they're all saying they're going to be using the office differently. Now, I've been working from home for about 2 months now, and there's definitely things about it I like. But I'm currently doing this video from a laundry room. The house is not designed for work from home, so I think everybody's making do and making the best that we can. But I don't think this is an ideal way for me to work, for me to be productive. And I know a lot of people feel that way. And similarly, or on the other side of the coin, I talked to some of my friends who work in Toronto or San Francisco or New York, and I mean, some of them had like an hour 30, hour 40 commute each way in the morning. And I don't know, maybe I'm lucky that I live in KW and I don't have to deal with things like that. But there's some areas, the dense concrete jungle of New York, where they don't know how to get around without, they don't have a good solution for the workforce using public transit and then queuing up for the elevators at these massive towers. I think we'll see more work from home in environments like that versus somewhere like KW, where it's a very walkable environment. We have a lot more room with our real estate. We're less crowded. We don't have as many office towers. We have more great suburban locations. So I think all of these headlines are going to, the impact and the actual how these are implemented, I think is going to vary widely region by region. And I think they should vary widely region by region. And we're also seeing some broad overgeneralizations based on 8 weeks of data. I think it's amazing how well some teams are working from home. But I also don't think the way that people are working from home during a pandemic, when their kids are out of school and don't have childcare, I don't think that's indicative of what a lot of people want the new normal to be. So I think we're going to continue to see this evolve as we go forward.
The adoption, the communication.
Yeah, somebody who manages an office.
Well, the digital communication adoption has been tremendous, and it has been both by choice and necessity a wonderful opportunity to keep the ball moving forward and to stay connected. But many of us will recognize that although we are connected and we are speaking and we are trying to be as efficient as possible, we still miss the interpersonal relationships that we have in the workplace, and the creativity that can spin out of something just simply because you happen to be in the work environment at that time, or the efficiencies of tackling all sorts of things on the spot in person is also tremendous. Our view is that it'll at some point rebalance. There's definitely a motivation to create a safe work environment. Working remotely is, I think, to an extent here to stay. It does work, but I think the pendulum is going to swing the other way, and at some point rebalance itself where the connectivity and the ability to communicate remains very much a digital place, but we're still getting the benefits of working together and being under the same roof. And our view is that, you know, it takes a culture to win. It's very difficult to build culture when many of us are separated and working in different places. And the workplace risks the commoditization of the employee, where that stickiness may erode over time if there's nothing more than speaking through the digital aspects. But it's going to be an interesting place. There will be companies that will be looking for less real estate because of simple market drivers. They need time to rebound. Maybe their industry is fundamentally changed. And then there are some which will say, okay, we're going to blend it and have certain groups work digitally, and some will be in the office. And then if we keep our footprint the same, then we'll just add density down the road when it's safer and everybody feels comfortable to be in that environment again. But that's one interesting aspect that you know, all eyes are on that, and it's hard to say now what the long-term outcome will be on that front.
Yeah. One of the other interesting things we've been talking to our clients about who operate retail establishments, generally restaurants and bars, is what phase one of the reopening might look like. So this is a graphic that shows a restaurant that currently has an occupancy of 84 plus 16 to 18 employees, going down with social distancing to 27 seats, 4 to 6 sideways seats, and 4 to 6 employees, because trying to keep social distancing in the kitchen. So every municipality and province is likely to have different guidelines. So you want to engage an architect or an interior designer or a planning firm to work on your specific requirements for your site. But there's definitely going to be a lot of impact, at least in the initial phases. This is a graphic.
Sorry, one comment, Ben. Sorry, yeah, no, I just want to comment that there's an enhanced interest amongst many of the restaurant groups we're working with to have expanded patio space. And where that patio space can't be accommodated within that specific building or on the property specifically the owner has, that there's a motivation to speak with the municipalities about possibly expanding patios onto sidewalks and streetscapes where you can still achieve the distancing, but you're able to accommodate more persons than if you were just confined to your own patio space you already had or within your premises. So go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, and on that point, Mike, I think especially for our retail establishments that are along the LRT route, that'll be something they can look at, because they'll have less parking requirements and we have more adoption of that. So there's a lot of unique things that I've seen online the last couple months. This is one I really like. This is from a not-for-profit that runs a restaurant in Amsterdam, and they've built little glass houses that they have people dine in. They have a heck of a view, so maybe it's a location-specific thing. When I posted this on my LinkedIn, some of my friends said, "Oh, that's so cute, that's so romantic." Some of my friends said, "That looks crazy. I wouldn't go out to eat if I had to eat in an enclosed house." And so I think there's some interesting concepts that people are going to decide if they like or don't like. I know, you know, maybe 3 months ago, if somebody told me I would pay good money to a restaurant to buy something that I would assemble at my house, I might think it was a bit ridiculous. Now it's a luxurious night out where I get to assemble this gourmet chef meal that was put together by a great local business. So I think all of our tastes are and demands are changing a bit. So as we help businesses reopen, we're doing a lot of consulting about how to reopen safely and productively. So here are some of the resources that our firms put together, and we're happy to send these out to everybody. We have a very extensive guide for workplace and facilities. So that's whether you are operating a school, an office building, be most suited towards that. We have a great guide for warehousing and manufacturing, and then also a retail guide on things store owners and retail operators can do to make the customer feel confident to come back into the store, to engage, to spend money again. And we are putting these together customized for different businesses, and we're happy to chat offline about that. I'll just give a bit of a quick overview of what some of those playbooks look like. So it's a 4-step approach. We're coming in, we're taking a look at the culture, the space, we're talking to the people, what are the different regulatory guidelines for your different business in the municipality. You know, somebody who's operating in Guelph might have slightly different restrictions or things they're allowed to do versus somebody who's in New Hamburg or Ayr or in one of the more rural settings. The second thing is we're putting together a customized plan. So that's all around change management, how to get people to adopt these new plans where you're talking about walking around an office in one way. You're talking about getting people used to washing their hands or sanitizing when they come into the office, when they come back from lunch, not just before they eat or use the facilities. And then we're putting together a detailed playbook. So these are generally somewhere between 30 and 40 pages. And we're helping the implementation of that. I'm just going to share some slides from one of the playbooks. So this walked specifically through what you should be doing to get your building ready to accept people coming back. So this is when you haven't been in there for 2 months. What are some of the things you need to do? You're not just flipping a switch and hoping the HVAC's working. And you know, what are your additional cleaning requirements around your kitchen, your washroom facilities? Which of those are managed by the landlord, which are managed by the tenant, and then taking a deep dive around individual workplaces and space plans and saying, where do we have pinch points? Where are areas of concern? What are some easy fixes we think we can make? Where are some areas where we think we might have to bring in some new furniture or spend some capital, and working through that. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. We'd be happy to go through any additional questions now. And then Mike and I and our consulting and brokerage team would be happy to talk to anybody offline, whether it's a review of the lease or walking the space. We're able to do that virtual tours. We have some great technology for that. And then we're also doing in-person tours with full PPE. You know, we're keeping safe, but we are an essential service. And we're here to serve as a resource. We want to get the community opened up again safely. I think the public health is the most important thing, and then the local economy. And we want to make sure that both of those are firing on full cylinders.
2 things, Ben, and to add to your comments, the recovery readiness guide. It's such a clean and easily followed roadmap, especially during this time where we've got so much information coming from different places, and a lot of it is about what's happening now, what's happened looking back to when this crisis started. The roadmap is a great way of looking at what's next and what can you do to step by step declutter all the things going on and thoughts of what to do in the workplace. This is a great guide that takes you through all the different considerations and thoughts that go into getting the workplace restarted, getting the business re-energized, and looking to the next challenges. So that said, we are definitely happy to speak with anybody about what this guy can do. Our website has also got a tremendous COVID-19 database of various resources that are available to you as well. And we're obviously very, very much available, open for business, and helping clients now implement many of the items that we brought up today. Additionally, before we wrap it up, there's also owner-occupiers. These are property owners that have their own business in their own building that they own, and this guide very much applies to those companies as well, which have workplaces that have been that have reduced occupancy or have been affected by the COVID-19 crisis, but are now looking to reopen, and under what is now viewed as being the right way to open, or one of the right ways to open. So this is a great guide for them as well. And with respects to owner occupiers, there's one topic that I think we should cover before we sign off. But as an owner occupier, there are challenges out there, the same as anyone else. And so we have seen a trend in many property owners liberating the capital they have within the holdings they have in order to shore up the business and inject cash into the business. So sale-leasebacks have become at this stage more and more of a conversation piece with many of these owner occupiers, and that's a big part of possibly financing the business moving forward during this credit crunch, because the credit crunch is here. The conventional large banks, the lenders are not freely lending as they did before the crisis began. So there are some solutions there as well, which can be beneficial to the owner occupier, and we also have relationships where lending is still something that's happening at this stage. So if anybody has some questions or wants to have an offline conversation about that, the financing still exists, and we have people that we can direct you to as well to provide assistance there for that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I appreciate you adding that. And I've just brought up on the screen our website. This is specifically the Insights page that has our COVID guides. So we're happy to send these to you, or if you want to just jump on our website, it's cushwakewr.com/insights. And we'll send that link around in the follow-up email that Allison and Christine are sending out.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Benjamin and Michael. We are now at 2:30, and we didn't have any additional questions. So I think you've answered some great questions during the presentation and gave us some really thorough information during your presentation. So thank you to you both for spending your time with us this afternoon and sharing your expertise to help the business community through this time. To our attendees, as I mentioned in the opening, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to today's webinar recording, and we will also provide a link to the Cushman & Wakefield site so you can access these resources. Please feel free to visit the Chamber's website for upcoming webinars. We do have a webinar scheduled for Monday, which is Hot Topics in HR during this time. Again, to Benjamin and Michael, thank you so much for your time today, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks so much.